Welcome to the College Neuro Network, a podcast series a part of Simply Neuroscience's The Synapse. My name is Lina.
And my name is Katie, and we're your hosts for today. The College Neuro Network has discussions with undergraduate students studying neuroscience and neuroscience professors in order to gain insight into the neuroscience departments and opportunities of the nation's top universities.
Today's episode is focused on the University of Pennsylvania, a private Ivy League research university in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. With its hundreds of study, research, and internship opportunities, passionate student body, and interdisciplinary curriculum, UPenn ranks number 6 in national universities by the U.S. News and World Report.
Today, joining us is Dr. Kable, a professor of neuroscience and psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome, Professor Kable. Thank you so much for joining us today to discuss your experiences as a professor at UPenn.
Thanks for having me.
So our first question is, could you please briefly introduce yourself and tell us what sparked your interest in both neuroscience and psychology?
Sure. So my name is Joe Kable. I'm a professor in the psychology department at the University of Pennsylvania. I also supervise students in what is now known as the undergraduate neuroscience major, as well as students in the graduate program in neuroscience, in addition to psychology. And we can talk a little bit about the different ways you can study neuroscience at Penn. How did I get interested in this? I have always been interested in how the brain works and what the relationship is between the brain and behavior. And so back when I was college, even, when I was in college, there was hardly any way to study neuroscience as an undergraduate. My university started, back when I was a student, was sort of the first days of an undergraduate major that would go on to become, what you might call neuroscience. And so, I had this fascination and, how does the brain work, that I tried to pursue in the ways that I could. And I ended up pursuing it through chemistry initially, looking at brain chemistry and learning about dopamine. And, from there, I wanted to know how the brain worked at a larger scale. And that led me into cognitive neuroscience and brain imaging, which was also something that was very new when I was a student. And then that, sort of led me into psychology and economics. And, what I study is how people make decisions and what the neural mechanisms of decision-making are, using a variety of techniques that allow us to assess brain function in humans, neuroimaging, neurostimulation, looking at people with brain damage, and lots of others.
Yeah, that's awesome. We look forward to learning more about that throughout the rest of the podcast. So now segueing into your role as a professor at UPenn, we were wondering if you could describe what your day-to-day life as a professor at UPenn looks like and what are some of your responsibilities.
Sure. So, as a professor, we have a variety of responsibilities, both kind of leading a research group as well as teaching classes. And so my day-to-day life is a lot of multitasking. So I go back and forth between being the principal investigator of a research lab. And what that might mean is I might have a meeting with a graduate student that I'm working with, or with a postdoctoral fellow who has a PhD that I'm working with, or with one of my research staff, talking about a current research project that we're doing and what's the stage that we're at. And we got this data and it doesn't make sense. And let's try and look at it and see how we can, make sense of it and what's the next step. Or maybe it involves working on a report, results from our research, right? And so, trying to figure out how do we best express this so that the readers get what we're doing in that study. And so, I do a lot of that. I have to fit in between that teaching. And so getting ready to give a lecture to undergraduates, which, it doesn't just, I don't just go in and wing it. Right. So there's a lot that goes into the preparation of, what you're going to say when, and what, how what's on the screen corresponds to what you're going to say. And then actually being in the classroom, lecturing to students, or what a lot of my classes have moved to now, having interactive, active learning exercises in class that we have to design and then, help run in the classroom, and then summarize, what is it that we're learning from those exercises. And then on top of that, there are also service responsibilities as a professor. So there are committees that you serve on that kind of keep the university running, whether that might be a committee about undergraduate or graduate education, or whether that's a committee about one of my big responsibilities these days is I'm the director of MindCore, which is the Center for Outreach Research and Education around the Mind at the University of Penn. And so what we're trying to do there is a lot of, behind the scenes support of the research enterprise at Penn, trying to understand the relationship between the mind and brain, our educational enterprises trying to understand the mind and brain, and, outreach to the community about the mind and brain. And so, there's a lot of behind the scenes stuff that we do there. So between research, teaching, and service responsibilities, I often joke that I have 2 full-time jobs. So, because you're really going back and forth between all of those things.
So moving on to some UPenn specific questions, what drew you to becoming a professor at the University of Pennsylvania specifically?
So, a couple of things, in terms of my academic history, I was a graduate student at Penn. So by the time the decision had to be made about where I was going to be a professor, I had some experience with it. And so, there was some familiarity with the place as a student, and definitely some feelings of affiliation with the school from that time that led me to come back. As a professor and as someone interested in neuroscience, I think Penn is a really interesting place for a couple of reasons. One is it's a place where it's easier for something like neuroscience that is very integrative, that doesn't necessarily fit in the classic departmental structure of the university, right? You've got biologists, you've got psychologists, you've got biochemists, you've got clinicians in psychiatry or neurology. Being able to bring those people together for a neuroscience program, whether it's at the undergraduate level or at the graduate level, you really need to be able to be cross-cutting across all those different sectors of the university. And Penn is one place where that's a little easier. One, because we're all in one place. People are sort of surprised that, I just gave you a whole bunch of different corners of the university, and we've been lucky and able at Penn to get those corners, fit those corners together on campus in a way that I can, everyone I need to reach is almost in the same building as me now, because we have a nice corridor of really a nice neuro, brain and biological, brain and psychological sciences corridor of campus where people are next to each other. So there's something physically that's nice about Penn's organization from that perspective. Also, just the people and the university culture is one that's very collaborative, and one in which you have people working together on projects, and often you'll have multiple faculty on projects and collaborate. I think that's a spirit that I really like about Penn, and I think it also makes the research that gets done there better, because people aren't trying to do it all on their own. They're really bringing experts in for the different components of the project and trying to get the best of all worlds when you run a research project. Pleasant environment to work in when it's nice and they get along and collaborate.
What are some of your favorite and least favorite, if you have one thing about teaching at UPenn?
Oh, favorite and least favorite. My favorite thing about teaching is that I'm lucky to teach material that that students find really interesting. How does the brain work? What's the relationship between the brain and behavior? Like what's going on inside your head that leads you to behave in certain ways? How is it that people make decisions? What accounts for the fact that sometimes we seem to make funny decisions? These are all really interesting topics. And so I think what it leads to is the students being really interested in the material. And there are a lot of just, that kind of energy when the students have questions, and they're great questions, and in some cases they're great questions that we just don't know the answer to because nobody's gone and looked for the answer yet. And that's just a real fun part about teaching, and probably my favorite part about teaching at Penn. Least favorite, I tell my students that I provide grades in my classes because I'm required to, but that's, it's like, it's part of the job description. I have to do a grade. But that from my perspective as a professor, like that's the least important part of this whole enterprise. Like and so I try and be fair, but if you're in my class and what you're primarily concerned about is, what's the grade that I'm going to get, like we're going to bump up against each other, because that's not my primary concern. Like I want you to, I want you to learn something. I want you to ask interesting questions. I want you to feed your creativity and your interest and your imagination. And that's why that's why I'm in the classroom.
So UPenn has a reputation for allowing students to both learn theory and apply it practically. For example, like a marketing student might learn about business in the classroom and then apply it through internship. In your view, how does neuroscience students take advantage of this policy?
It's interesting that you bring up marketing as an example, because I think there are lots of examples where students learn neuroscience and then apply it in, outside of a research context, but in other contexts where you might use it. One of the things that we have at Penn is an initiative called the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative. So it's in the business school, and a lot of what they do is working with businesses to think about ways in which you could take insights from neuroscience and apply them to business. And so there are a lot of students that are now in part of those efforts, right? Where they might learn about some neuroscience facts, and then you might ask, how would we apply it in this business context? Or, a real concrete example, they're working on development of remote technology for measuring EEG, so that you could have somebody with an EEG cap while they're driving a public transit bus and try and assess, how their cognitive state varies over the day, or why they were out with, last summer, they were out doing this with a soccer team, right? Like, and trying to assess brain activity online during these activities. So I think that's one example where students would both learn in the classroom about neuroscience and apply it outside of the classroom. I think also, we're obviously we've got a great medical school. I think it's even higher than sixth on in terms of its ranking. And so there are also a lot of students who I think do the application of neuroscience in more of a clinical direction. So maybe they learn some basic neuroscience and then see how this might apply to the understanding of a disease. How do we understand the disease process in Parkinson's disease, or the disease process in Alzheimer's disease, and how's that related to what you learn in your classes or what you learn in your research about neurons work, or about how larger neural systems work. And so you would get both classroom experience and an applied experience that's in a more clinical direction. It's probably not surprising, given Penn, and the fact that we've got, in addition to a great undergraduate school, a great business school, and a great medical school, that as undergrads, people will take advantage of those other schools, the opportunities that having those other schools on campus would permit.
Speaking of the classrooms, how are the undergrad classrooms about neuroscience and psychology structured? Like, are they more lecture-based, like reading, or like discussions?
It varies a lot depending on the class. I think the introductory classes, so if you were to take Psych 101, or if you were to take BBB 109, which will be Neuroscience 109 once the name change goes through, you would have in that introductory class a lot of lectures, and then some outside activities, but most of the classroom would be lecture. I think that changes quite a bit as you go through your neuroscience or psychology education at Penn, in that as you get into the higher level classes, so for example, the class that I teach, what you'll see is more discussion-based classes, less lecture-based classes, and more classes that are engaging in other forms of active learning, where maybe in the classroom, you're doing a problem set and then coming back with your answers, and we're discussing, why one answer may be a better answer to this question than another answer is. And there's a lot more of that in the advanced courses. There's also, as you advance, in the neuroscience major, the next big class after the introductory class is one that has a very detailed lab component to it. So you're actually spending time, in a laboratory trying to record from neurons and do a neural recording. So you're actually going to learn some hands-on electrophysiology in that class. You'll do a brain dissection in that class. And so it's very hands-on. So progression really goes from classes that may be more lecture-based in the beginning to classes that are more activities and discussion as you move through your undergraduate major.
So another big thing about Penn, of course, is like the interdisciplinary nature of academics. So we were wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that interdisciplinary nature impacts students studying neuroscience. Like, for example, you mentioned you're interested in economics. So how would studying economics enhance your study of neuroscience?
Sure. So to answer that specific question, I think there are a lot of reasons where, this interdisciplinary nature can be helpful. But from the perspective of understanding how does the brain make decisions, one of the things that you get by looking at economics is formal theories of how you should solve different problems. Given that you have this kind of decision that you should make, how should you make that decision? And what that tells you, that obviously doesn't tell you how people make decisions or how the brain makes decisions, but it gives you a starting point, right? Because now you can say, okay, if you were to build the system from first principles, you would build it this way. Let's look and see, what are the similarities and differences between that structure in terms of what variables of the decision process people are paying attention to. Let's look and see how similar the way people make decisions is compared to that formal theory. And then that formal theory tells you some signals that you might look for in the brain that, and this has been, for the research that I do, this has really been a very important approach to understanding how the brain makes decisions. We sort of start with economics and first principles, and it says, well, given this, we would expect that there'd be we would predict that there might be a representation of the value of the different things that you could choose from in your brain. And we go and look for it, and lo and behold, we see that it's there, right? And then you can start to ask more sophisticated decisions about how that representation might relate to somebody's behavior, and how it might explain, this is where it gets really interesting to me, how it might explain how human decision-making differs from that abstract formal theory that you get in economics.
So on the topic of your research, it would be great if you could talk a little bit more about like how you're conducting that research, and perhaps like what has been your most exciting or interesting findings, what has inspired you to pursue that research?
So we have, there are a lot of different ways in which we study the relationship between brain and decision and in humans. We look at brain activity with non-invasive brain imaging. We manipulate brain activity with non-invasive brain stimulation. We look at people who look at how the brain is related to differences in the structure and how people's brains are structured, and how we look at different disease states and with known changes in brain structure and relate that to decision making. And of course, do a lot of measuring of behavior as well. In terms of some interesting things that we have found just recently, and I have recency bias from what I was thinking about like this morning, but I think it's a pretty cool result. We can show that if we measure your brain activity while all of these experiments have the structure of, we give you an option and you decide whether you want to take it or not. So, but it's in different domains. So maybe it's a domain about money, and you have a default option of you can just take $10, or you have an option which is variable, where you could take $15, but it's in a month from now, or it's $20, but it's a year from now, or it's $15, but it's only a 50% chance of that. And so we vary what the option is. And then there's a bunch of different experiments that you could do in the structure in different domains, not about money, but about food. You could have a default option, or you could have, we'll show you all the different foods from the vending machine, and which ones would you take relative to the default. Or it could be, we show you basically different domains of evaluation, right? We've got other domains where people are looking at pictures of faces and they're just rating how attractive they are, more attractive faces, less attractive faces. We've got other domains where you're just imagining future events, right? We have you imagine being on the beach, or imagine going to work a week from now. And again, you can evaluate those as being more positive events or more negative events. The really exciting finding to me is that we can now use your brain activity while you're engaged in those different tasks and considering those different options. And we can predict across all of those different domains when you're thinking about something that you're evaluating more positively versus more negatively, using the same pattern of brain activity. So the same pattern of brain activity that predicts that you think $15 a year from now is a bad deal is the same pattern of brain activity that predicts that you think Cheetos don't taste good, is the same pattern of brain activity that predicts that you really are not looking forward to going to work next week, is the same pattern of brain activity that predicts that, oh, this face in front of me, I don't think it's, that attractive. And to me, that's really exciting because it suggests that there is what we call a common neural currency for evaluation, that there's abstract and general evaluative kind of positive negative signals in the brain that are present across multiple different domains. They're not about faces per se, or money per se, or food per se. They're about good versus bad, and that and I think we've been able to show that in a really compelling way now, and it's I find it really exciting.
Yeah, that sounds really fascinating. So connecting that to the undergraduate experience, in your sense, do you think that research opportunities for undergraduate students at UPenn are really accessible, and how would undergraduates go about getting involved in research at UPenn?
I think research is very accessible, and sometimes we're trying to do even better at earlier on in the undergraduate experience, kind of explaining to people how it is that you can go about getting involved in research. I think just from the pure number of people who study neuroscience at Penn, there are so many different opportunities to get involved in research, and they really span the gamut. I mean, I talked about people who are applying neuroscience in business and people who are doing very clinically oriented research, and then you have people who are doing research that's recording from neurons or doing brain imaging like I do. There's a lot of opportunities. Usually the ways in which somebody would get involved in research in my lab, there's a couple of different ways. I mean, one is through a paid research assistantship position, which could be a work study position. So you could do this for your work study job if you qualify for work study, where you would be involved in a research project that way. All of our undergraduate majors that are relevant, we have the neuroscience major, the psychology major. We also have a major in cognitive science, which is relevant to the study of brain and mind, with a neuroscience track within cognitive science, cognitive neuroscience. All of those majors require you to do at least one semester of independent research for course credit. And many of the students who are really interested in research can do more than one semester. So you could do, I've had students do 4 semesters of independent research for course credit. And there, again, you'd be working in the lab, you'd have a project that you would be the lead on, and you'd be working towards that project over the course of a semester or a year or longer, depending on how long you wanted your independent study for. And then we're blessed to have a good number of summer programs as well that are aimed at Penn undergrads. So there's a program that is school-wide that encourages undergraduates to do research after their first year in the summer. And so students who are interested in neuroscience could do neuroscience research through that program. It's run by the Center for Undergraduate Research and Fellowships, or CURF. We have a program through the center that I direct, MindCore, for upper level students who are in their rising juniors or rising seniors as opposed to rising sophomores, where they work again in the summer in one of our laboratories that studies the mind and brain. And so those summer opportunities, I think, are also a really good opportunity for the students, because there you're able to, I just think it's a different quality experience when you're able to delve into the research and see what would it be like to do this, my career, as opposed to fitting it in amongst one of the things that's very typical of, I think it's typical of all students. I've just sampled Penn students, so all I can say is it's very typical of Penn students is that they have a lot going on. They've got classes and extracurriculars and this club and that fraternity or sorority and that sports team, and so when school's in session, there's just a million things competing for your time in addition to your research position, whether it's a research assistantship or whether it's an independent study. And it's just to be able to dedicate 40 hours a week and spend in the lab over the summer is just a different quality experience. And I think it more closely, it's a closer experience to what it would actually be like to be a scientist, whether that's a scientist in industry or a scientist in academia or a graduate student or a medical student or what have you.
Well, that seems like a lot of opportunities for undergraduates to get involved in research. We were wondering if you had any advice for like high school students that are listening who want to study neuroscience or psychology in college, and maybe even at UPenn. And is it possible for them to get involved in any research, or is there any programs and resources you think they should check out?
There are some programs for the students who are still in high school. There's some summer programs. There are also some summer programs that are geared towards high school students that Penn runs. A lot of summer academies that are, I think the closest one, I don't know if there's one that's neuroscience focused, but there's definitely like a biology summer academy that would have some neuroscience to it. There are some opportunities for high school students to get in hands-on research over the summer as well. One of them that I'm involved in is called the LENS program, the Laboratory Experiences in the Natural Sciences at Penn. And then, I think if this is an area that you're interested in going into at college, one thing to think about is what classes, what should you take to kind of prepare yourself. And I think it's going to be one class that you, should definitely take. Everyone's going to take biology, but if you want to try and do, a more advanced biology course, that's going to prepare you. If you have an opportunity you definitely want to take, in my experience, you want to take math courses, get into calc, so that you're prepared in terms of, because all of these fields require, you really want to know how to do, statistical analyses of your data. And so you want to have the mathematical foundation that when you get to college, you can learn the statistics. And so the math is a good foundation. And then, I think not every school has a psychology course, but many of them do. And many of them have AP Psych. And I think that's also a good preparation for studying neuroscience.
That wraps up our questions for you. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us at the College Neuro Network. Your responses were really insightful and will definitely help students who want to study neuroscience, perhaps even at UPenn. So thank you so much.